This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Marcin Swysz Spyderco Bowie, which is a re-release, in particular, the re-release that was done by Knife Joy in 2023 and 2024. This is a classic Spyderco design, which was, one of sort of the first really big hype knives, at least since I came into knife collecting. I know there were plenty before that. Hinders used to have a lot of hype, things like that, especially in that overbuilt era. But this was one of the first ones that I saw where a YouTuber, particularly Nick Shabazz, basically led to a run on these knives because he gave such a favorable review of the original Swysz Bowie. That was back in 2015. And then years later, meaning about 1 to 2 years ago, Knife Joy reached out to Spyderco and basically got these re-released in M390 steel with blue anodized scales and a couple other small internal changes. We are going to review this. It remains a very hype knife. Every single time this goes up, it sells out. We are going to review this based on how well it actually performs as a knife. How much do I enjoy carrying it? How much do I enjoy using it? How much do I think you will enjoy carrying and using it? And so we're going to look at that standard at today's price point, and let's just get to it. 3 sections of my review. Start with specifications, look at the knife tip to tail. Then we put it on our scoring system. 10 areas of scoring, some addressing the fun factor, some addressing utility. And then finally, I'll summarize with my pros, cons, and neutrals about the knife as a whole. Specifications. This version here of the Spyderco Swysz Bowie is made in Taiwan, like all of Spyderco's Swysz models to date have been. Marcin Swysz, his maker's mark is right here. Relatively well-known custom knife designer, better known for his extensive collaboration with Spyderco, which include the Techno 1, Techno 2, the upcoming Techno 3, the Swayback, the Spidey Chef, and the Swysz Bowie here. All of those, including the Swysz Bowie to date, have been made in Spyderco's Taichung, Taiwan factory, though the upcoming Techno 3 will be made in Italy. The price on this modern version is $449. Nick Shabazz talked about this in his review of this updated version. That actually does track with inflation relative to where the price of the old one was. But as we know, inflation has been quite painful. That is a significant increase in price over what this Spyderco Swysz Bowie debuted for back in the original version. Blade length is 3.14 inches. Blade thickness is 138 thousandths, which is relatively thick for Spyderco, especially for Spyderco's out of Taichung, Taiwan. They tend to be decently thinner than that. This version here is in M390. You can see right there. The original version was in XHP. Length overall, 7.79 inches, 4.3 ounces. This is a full titanium handle with a G10 backspacer here, but there is no internal milling on any of on these scales or on any of Marcin Swysz's designs with Spyderco. They just don't do internal milling. And like, again, all of the existing Swysz designs, it is on washers. The upcoming Techno 3 will be on bearings, but to date, they've all been washer knives. Let's do some size comparisons before we get any further. The most relevant size comparison to start off with, I don't have a Techno on me right now, but I do have a Spidey Chef and a Swayback. My review on the Spidey Chef is upcoming. As you might remember, my review on the Swayback was very positive. I find the ergonomics and cutting performance on this knife very, very impressive. But you can see Marcin Swysz has a size range that he certainly operates in. The Techno is obviously significantly smaller than these, but these 3 knives are all almost exactly the same size in terms of overall length, though obviously that Swayback is going to be the smallest in the pocket, and the Spidey Chef is thinner than the Bowie, but about the same size overall. Let's do some other knives to compare to. The most obvious comparison here is your large Sebenza. And you can see it is a little bit smaller in the blade, a little bit smaller in the handle than your large Sebenza, while sharing a lot of just general sort of aesthetic and design cues. It's more curvy, Obviously, being a Spyderco rather than a Chris Reeve, there's some things that you would call out, but there's definitely some similarity between those knives here. To compare to another Spyderco, here's your PM2. You can see a little bit shorter in both the blade and the handle than your PM2. One thing to point out here is your blade stock. You can see the blade stock here is about as thick. It's only slightly thinner than the PM2. Again, that is unusual for Spyderco. Even though Spyderco's most popular models, the PM2, the Yojimbo, the Shaman, all have that 145 thousandths blade stock thickness, the majority of Spyderco's catalog does have thinner blade stock than this, and I'm actually not aware of another knife out of Tai Chung, though I'm probably just forgetting it, that has blade stock quite this thick. Here is compared to your AD20. This is in particular an AD20S, so you can't tell from this angle. Again, there's sort of a general similarity to the vibe here, other than the blade shape, which is obviously quite different. But there's some similar design cues in the handle design here, but the AD20 is obviously a significantly larger knife. And then your 940 here, you can see a little bit shorter in the handle, a little bit shorter in the blade than the 940, while being a significantly larger object, just because it is much taller. So now, let's look at what this knife is. Let's just go through the details here, and let's start with the blade. So, very interesting blade shape here. I haven't seen many blades that look exactly like this. So this is really a kind of extended clip point. But what Slysz has done with this clip point, basically you're taking your flat top here and you're just clipping that off. By the way, it's crowned all the way along the clip, but squared off on the back of the blade, which is a cool little design detail. But rather than having a sort of typical clip point which has a more gradual belly, it's flat well past where the clip begins. It's flat about a little more than halfway through the blade, and then you get this big belly up here. What that means in terms of blade performance and what tasks this is good at is it ends up being sort of for slicing cuts where you either are down on a table, you can almost use this for like a little bit of food prep, or for cuts where you're passing through something and using that belly. It works really well. What you do end up with, though, is a very high tip, which is hard to get down on the table for some utility cuts. And because this whole thing isn't belly, because you do have this flat here, you kind of end up, like as I'm cutting cardboard or something like that, I want to get to that belly as quickly as I can. So I kind of end up, if my cardboard is like here, I'm pushing through the knife until I get to that belly and then trying to carve through with that belly once I get there. It feels quite different in use than I expected. It's a funny sort of blade shape in terms of the cutting edge to get used to. Mostly just because it's unusual. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it is different in a way that really does affect utility. One thing that is notable with the blade shape, though, is 138,000 stock. Tai Chung, you can see from the plunge here, has a pretty aggressive grind on there. If you just look at, how much you can see it drop there. But this is a very tall blade, and it does come down to a nice sharp cutting edge. This is my edge on here. The factory edge was neither notably good nor notably bad, but this does get quite sharp at the edge. It's not the sharpest thing in the world, but you do have the benefit of getting relatively thick stock, at least by 2024 standards. Back in 2015, a lot of blade stocks were thicker than they are today, so 138 wasn't quite so unusually thick back then. But these days, 138 is on the thicker end of blade stocks you tend to see, but you still get some really nice cutting performance because of all this space to drop for this blade. Spidey hole is typical for Tai Chung, which means they knock it down very, very low. Access to the Spidey hole is very easy while the knife is closed. Very natural. Your thumb just wants to go right there, and it flicks out very nicely and easily. Your thumb can catch that hole and just pop it out just like that. Now, just to finish on the blade, the jimping back here, Tai Chung does really good jimping. It's even a little sharper than Golden Colorado jimping. It is absolutely functional jimping. Not just aesthetic. You can put your thumb here and it will grab you back for sure. You can also, quite easily pinch up on this blade, use that Spidey hole for purchase, get your thumb in there, and use that to sort of grab the blade and grip the blade like that. One last thing on the blade. You wouldn't know it just looking at this one, but they did switch from a stone wash finish that is very similar to the finish that is on the sway back here. This was the finish on the original Swysh Bowie. This M390 here has a belt satin instead. I expect that probably has something to do with the fact that it's probably more difficult to get that kind of stonewash finish on M390. I do know that XHP is part of the reason a lot of custom makers like it is easy to put some really nice finishes on XHP. Obviously, M390 is a higher edge retention steel than XHP. It's a little less tough, but it's different. It's probably the better choice for where the market is today. Action. Action is, like with all Marcin Swysh designs, notably good. This is an extremely smooth and consistent washer action. It's not quite at the level of a Sebenza. It's not quite that smooth, but it does give you a little bit of that sort of oil on glass feel that's been consistent across all of Marcin Swysh's knives that I have handled, with this and the Techno really being the best of the bunch. It is definitely notable. Your lock bar access, very good here. This is a frame lock. Lots of space there to get to that lock bar. You got a nice little chamfer there with sort of a chamfer on the chamfer. Very easy to stick your thumb in there, disengage the lock. Easy, effortless. Lock bar tension is relatively light. Just a very satisfying, nice, easy knife to actuate, which then brings us to the scales. So first off, in terms of what they are, these are full titanium scales, blue anodized with this bead blasted finish on it. Will pick up snails like a Chris Reeve. Those end up just, to me, looking nice. It wears in nicely. It looks like a tool as a result. All of these screws are also blasted, which keeps with that sort of matte finish. The clip is blasted, screws on this side are blasted. It looks like a user, contrasts nicely with this the pop of satin on the blade. And of course, these scales are, let me fold up the knife here, fully contoured, and it's a pretty aggressive contour. So this entire titanium scale is contoured the whole way on both sides. In terms of the handle design, typical for Marcin Swysh, kind of like the blade is a little off kilter, this is a little bit unusual in terms of the shape of the handle. It's really like, it's not consistently a set of curves, it's not consistently a set of straight lines. You've got this kind of weird little warble down the bottom. It looks flat with sort of a kick here and a kick here, but then when you look more closely, there is a little bit of belly in there and a little curve right there. And across the back, you got this notch here, which is purely aesthetic, but it is a cool little detail. You've got a nice curve on the front here, and then you've got a series of mostly straight but nicely knocked down at the corners, sort of flat across here, with a nice big curve across the butt. What this ends up being is again, it's sort of like a smushed down version of kind of what you get with an 80-20 handle. Obviously without the choil, where you get these anchor points do keep your hand in place, and this gradual swoop across the back rolls nicely into your palm. It works the same way here, where in the hand, your front finger goes right behind this guard, which provides plenty of protection to prevent you from slipping up on the blade. And by the way, this is very clearly a sharpening choil, not a finger choil. The rest of your fingers can rest neatly anywhere in here. This curve rolls nicely into your palm, and because the whole thing is contoured, it does have a bit of that sort of river rock feel to it. In fact, with the blasted titanium and the contouring, this feels as close to sort of holding a river rock as any knife that I've handled. The one other upgrade, other than the M390, the change in blade finish and the blue, the one other change which you can sort of see in here is there is a lock bar insert now. Marcin Swysh's knives that don't have lock bar inserts will have lock stick. At least every one that I've had has. This one has not had lock stick because of that insert. So that's what we're working with. Oh, and wire clip. I mentioned the clip before. I didn't say it was the wire clip. And a G10 backspacer, which is cool. I like G10 backspacers. It's a nice way to add a little bit of detail without adding much weight. And then in terms of your balance point, right about there. Right about where your second finger is going to land, or sort of between your first and second finger, which makes it feel a little handle heavy, but that kind of suits the slightly more robust feeling of this knife. You know, overall, with how much it weighs, 4.3 ounces, with the fact it's kind of squat, kind of chunky, which is kind of the way that relatively thick blade stock, that's sort of the way that Slysz makes a lot of his knives. This does feel like just a little bit of a chunky boy, and it feels like something that you sort of want to push a little bit. Definitely feels like it wants to be a user. With that, let's get to the scores. What do I think about this knife? And as you'll see here, the summary is this is a very, very cool knife, but I do think that the design has started to show its age. Again, I score across 10 categories, 5 of which are related to the fun factor of the knife, how enjoyable is it to use, and 5 of which are related to how useful the knife is, how its general utility. We'll start off with distinctiveness. And distinctiveness, this is clear, which is really how much is this knife not like anything else in the market. This is a 9 because the fact is this is a hyped up knife. Whatever the reasons behind it, the Slysz Bowie is the Slysz Bowie. There are a lot of people that want the Slysz Bowie. It does absolutely have a distinct design aesthetic. There is no other knife that looks quite like this. Marcin Slysz has a really interesting way, in the same way that sort of Serge Panchenko does, of taking a knife that if I broke this down to its pieces, wouldn't sound that unusual on paper, but just because of the unusual ways he shapes his blades, the unusual ways he shapes his handles, just the unified aesthetic he's got, he does have a design that he does have a design sense that feels all his own. And this is, if you want a Slysz Bowie, there is nothing else on the market that is a Slysz Bowie, and lots of people want a Slysz Bowie. There isn't really anything about the pieces of this knife that make it totally distinctive. You know, it is a titanium frame lock folder in M390, which is the most boring thing that a knife can be in 2024. Granted, at least it's on washers, not bearings, but I do have to give it credit that Marcin Slysz has really created what has become a classic design here, and people are willing to bend over backwards to get their hands on one. Not quite as much now that Knife Joy has put a lot more of these on the market, but back before the Knife Joy orders, it was insane. You were paying $600 sometimes to get one of these from the original runs. The design, I'm going to call this an 8. It's very close to being a 9. Again, the downside is that there isn't anything groundbreaking or actually in the details all that specifically interesting about this knife. It is a titanium frame lock folder with a big slicey Bowie blade. You know, that clip point there. Frame lock, nice action on washers. It's solid. But the reason that it's still an 8 is because every part of the design of this blade and this handle is just a little unusual. Again, the way this belly is pushed out toward the front makes it feel different in use and look quite different. The way that they did this cool little, you know, knocking down the edges or crowning the spine on the clip point here, keeping it flat there, and just the way that this handle is designed, the particular mix of curves and flats on this handle, the fact that they did contour all the titanium, the way that this bead blasted titanium wears in, it's just got a very unique feel, and all the lines work really, really well together on this knife. It just looks good. It's just a good looking knife. It looks good from every angle. It looks awesome once it's beat up. It is just a really nicely designed knife. There's a reason that people like Marcin Slysz's designs. They're just simply good. They just work. So that's a solid 8, borderline 9. Action. This is a really, really good washer action. Easy to disengage. Detent is pretty early. And then this is, again, not at the level of a Chris Reeve, not the level of like a Tom Mayo or some fancy custom, but this is about as nice of a washer action as I'm going to feel on a production knife. It is totally smooth and consistent the entire way. It just feels there's consistent resistance. It's not trying to be drop shotty, it's trying to be smooth. And then on top of that, the detent on the open it's not heavy, but it is heavy enough that when you get your thumb in there, it will reliably pop out. And it's just easy and controlled. You can slow roll it open if you want to, and it'll go out nice and easy. You can flick it open if you want to. This is a really satisfying washer action. You can sit and fidget with this all day if you want to. It just makes the knife feel that much more premium, that much more satisfying. Solid 8. Fit and finish. Taichung is, in my opinion, Spyderco's best factory. They're certainly the tightest and the sharpest. The grind here is pretty much immaculate, certainly immaculate from a large-scale production perspective. All the lines here are super crisp. Again, your jimping is crisp. That plunge, I love the way the Taichung does their plunges, that sharp line there. These handles are very nicely machined. Everything is flush. The contouring, again, is done really, really nicely. The bead blast is very even. And even the way it sort of picks up snails, it almost feels deliberate, where it picks them up gradually with use without showing them right away. Your backspacer here, nicely machined, nice and flush. The way that this blade sort of just merges into the handle here, nice and flush back there. It's just everything about this knife is made at a very high level for large scale or moderate scale production. It's in line with what you typically get out of Taichung Taiwan. It's just very, very good. There's nothing crazy that they're trying to do, but for a relatively simple design that is certainly a couple steps elevated above what Spyderco typically tries to do, that's a solid 8. And then cool factor is an 8 bordering on a 9. I put most of the hype factor in distinctiveness here, so I'm not going to double count and give it a 9 in cool factor as well, just because of the hype. But the fact is, as I've said before, Bowies are cool. Like, Bowies are just an inherently cool blade shape. The fact that this whole thing just kind of has that tanky vibe to it, it's kind of like if you like that utilitarian, almost slightly go beat me up feel you get from Serge Panchenko, but you don't want everything to be acid washed. Marcin Swysz does that really well. This feels very sort of machine-like. It feels like it wants to be used. It feels like it wants to be pushed, but it's still got that class and that level of premium execution to it. It feels like a nice premium object, and that makes it cool. You combine that with, again, this distinctive blade shape, the distinctive handle design. It's a cool object, and the fact is, we know people there are tons of folks on Instagram, Reddit, elsewhere that they'll have collections that are full of high-end custom knives, and you'll still see them, break out their Swysz Bowie when they want to, show off their knives, because this is a knife that no matter what is in your collection, it's cool to have a Swysz Bowie in your collection. It's just become kind of a classic design in that way. And so this gets a 41 in fun factor, and that really does reflect what the community has latched on to with the Swysz Bowie. This is a truly distinctive design in its details, despite being quite simplistic when you look at what it is on paper. And it's just, this is what you get when you work with a custom maker, a designer at the level of Marcin Swysz. You get something that can be really interesting and exceptional from a design perspective, often in subtle ways, but in ways that will be consistently recognized by the community, even if it's more on an intuitive level than explicit level. So 41 out of 50, that's a great score. Utility is where it starts to show its age. So cutting performance, I did mention before, 138 thousandths, I think I said, on the blade stock. This is a great grind here. This does come down to a pretty sharp, I would say even sometimes very sharp cutting edge. Especially when you lay the edge back, this knife can get very sharp. and it can slice very well. You feel that cutting cardboard, cuts cardboard very nicely. You feel that, working out in the garden, you feel it doing EDC tasks, things like that. This is a very nice performing edge. The reason it's a 7 and not higher is I did find this blade shape less intuitive to use than I would like. Probably if I used this exclusively more, I would get used to, how much there's the flat here and then there's this big belly up front. If I compare to, say, your AD20 here, you see how the belly, and obviously it's a bigger blade, but you see how the belly is more gradual on the AD20, where it's sort of covering the whole knife and there isn't quite as much flat. Whereas this one, the Bowie, just kind of flat, and then yeet, like curves up right at the end. I have found this particular shape, this particular belly, less intuitive, less easy to use. The high tip right next to a big belly like this, I don't feel like I have quite as much tip precision as I normally would like. It's just every time I've used this, I have been fighting against the blade shape just a little bit from a cutting perspective. When I want to, cut into leaves or stems or something like that in the garden, I have to sort of figure out where the edge is and think about how I'm going to get that edge onto the stem and how I'm going to keep it in the cut. When I'm using cardboard, I kind of want to, I think I said this before, push through this flat and get up to the belly as soon as I can. It just feels more natural that way. It slices really well. The edge slices nicely, but the blade shape has been a little bit unintuitive for me on just about every task I've used. So it's a 7. Works really nicely when you can get it to work, but there's a learning curve there. Robustness, this is a solid knife. You got full titanium scales here. You've got decently thick blade stock. M390 isn't the toughest steel, but you've got a nice solid frame lock. This is sort of a perfect example of a solidly tough knife. This is not a hard use knife, certainly with the M390 here and how thin this edge does get. This isn't something you're going to use to, cut down a tree, but there's also nothing about this knife that is fragile. There's nothing about that's skeevy. The lockup is rock solid, as you expect from Tai Chung. It's fine. 7. Carry. This is a 7 bordering on a 6. So it is relatively heavy in 2024, 4.3 ounces for, 3 inches of blade and change. That's about 1.5 ounces per inch, which is heavier than we'd like. Largely that is because they have done nothing to mill out these titanium scales. They could make it quite a bit lighter, at least shave off a few tenths of an ounce if they did do that, but that would drive the price even higher. It does feel handle heavy, which helps with the ergos, but hurts the carry. The big benefit with carry, and then the last negative, is it is, a decent sized object. If I compare this to my PM2 here, you'll see for most of the length of this knife, it's a little bit sort of taller, thicker than the PM2 is. But it's this dimension that really does help the carry. You can see it's a little bit thinner than the PM2, but more importantly, this contoured knives, anybody who's been in the game for a while and remembers, the Strider concealed carry idea, contoured handle scales like this are just easier to carry than flat scales. Because 1, they just don't protrude, they don't feel like a block in your pocket quite as much. And 2, it's easier to fit other things alongside this knife. Now, that will obviously scratch up the scales quite a bit if anything you're fitting next to it is metal, but that does make this easier to carry than other knives this size would tend to be. You balance that out and it ends up being a decent carry, not a great carry. It's heavier than we would typically like to see at this blade size in 2024, but those contoured scales get it to a 7. Feel and ergos have been a little bit disappointing, and this is sort of echoing my challenges with the blade shape. The problem with this handle design is that today, when there are a lot more knives and a lot more good knives on the market than there were back when this first came out in 2015, this handle feels stuck between two worlds. It's a relatively big, chunky handle. Like, this fills the palm nicely. It's thick, it's tall. It's thick and tall the entire length there. It's got, even though these are relatively subtle curves, this kind of sort of blocked off end design, you tend to see in harder use knives, especially with a thick butt like this. The problem is, this doesn't really want to be a hard use blade. This feels like a harder use handle, but this feels like a lighter use blade. This feels like a blade that wants to be slicey, that wants to be precise, and this handle feels a little big, blocky, and chunky for a more precise, and delicate isn't the right term, but a more sort of surgical kind of blade. And so anytime I was using the Slysz Bowie, I did feel like I was trying to balance between two worlds, where the handle wanted me to push this knife hard, to, really push it into the cut, to, do like, chops and stuff like that, to be aggressive with it, while the blade wanted me to be, precise and slicey and just to be really controlled with my cuts. Now, when you pinch up on this blade, it does pinch up very nicely. You can anchor your middle finger right behind that front guard, grab the blade, and it can do your delicate work, especially if you use this flat, very nicely right there. But this was not an intuitive knife to handle and use. I talk about the PM2 as sort of the gold standard on this, that when I'm using a PM2, I never have to look where the edge is. The edge is always exactly where I want it to be. It's just very intuitive. Part of that is I've been using a PM2 for 5 years now, but I'm not the only person to say that. It's just an intuitive blade shape. Between this blade shape and the handle just almost having a bit of an identity crisis. Again, in 2024, back in 2015, this was one of the very few knives that straddled that line between heavier duty use and lighter duty use. So it was unique back then. It was a knife that could do both those things when a lot of knives couldn't. Now it just feels a little bit stuck between worlds, and if I want a heavier duty, harder use knife, there are better heavy duty, harder use handles than this. If I want a delicate, precise knife, there are better delicate, precise knives than this. And it ends up feeling today like it kind of does both, not as well as alternatives I could have. And so for any given task, there was always another knife that I would have preferred to be using and carrying, even though it can do a little bit of everything. So this is a 6 for me because it was never all that satisfying to use. But I will say, if you are sort of the one knife person, you want one knife that can do everything okay, and you're all right sacrificing performance in any given domain for something that is a little more versatile, then I would bump a couple points off that or up on that, because this can be pushed both directions, both to lighter and harder use, in a way some knives do struggle. And then but I will say it is comfortable in the hand no matter what. The way these scales are rounded, the way this bead blast is done, it is comfortable in the hand. But again, just sort of to reiterate, it doesn't lock me in as much as I would like for a hard use knife, but it feels bigger and more ungainly than I would like for a precise and surgical knife. If you were asking me, I think this is better to go the lighter duty end of things, for them to mill out these scales, make it a significantly lighter knife, and then this could be a really, really good super slicey knife. That's the way that I would go with the Bowie V2. And then value is definitely a 6 these days. The fact is, this thing retails at $449. $449 is directly competing with Hinderer. It's directly competing with Chris Reeve. It's directly competing with Strider at retail. It's directly competing with Demco at retail. This is a nicely made knife. Everything about this is put together well, but nobody's going to be able to tell you that it is attempting. It's not even attempting to operate on the same level of precision, on the same level of design, on the same level of robustness as a lot of those other knives out there. It does feel expensive. There are a lot of knives that you can get this similar performance for less money, but again, the way it really does feel expensive is literally if I just take, these two knives here and you ask me which of them feels more premium. The Slysz Bowie feels nice, but it's not even a contest. The Sebenza just feels markedly better, and it does make the Slysz Bowie feel expensive. So that comes out to a 76 overall, and I think the overall theme is that this is a knife that is more fun than it is useful in 2024. It is still a very, very cool knife, and I don't think its cool factor has dulled all that much between 2015 and 2024, which is almost a decade. It is still a totally distinctive design. Slysz's designs have held up very well, and it is still one of the cooler knives to have in your collection. But from a utility perspective, it has started to feel its age, and it has started to feel dated, and I don't think, I'll say it in the positive sense, there are better options for any task you would want than the Slysz Bowie in 2024. 76 overall, which is a middle-of-the-road score, which reflects its sort of strong performance on the fun factor, and it's a little bit of underperformance on the utility. So really, if you summarize it, positives, the design remains great. Slysz's design remains distinctive, interesting, very cool. The way the handle is executed, this contouring is tastefully done. This bead blast is really nice. It's a nicely finished and nicely machined handle. The sharpness at the edge of this blade is great. They did a great job with this grind. I just talked in my last review, the Bodacious, about how Golden Colorado in that one didn't take that 125,000 stock down to a thin enough edge. This is thicker stock and feels sharper at the edge. And I think that's just Tai Chung doing a better job with the grind. It is sharp at the edge. And the action, super glassy smooth. Very nice. The neutral, the performance is eh. It is a knife that is kind of stuck between worlds. It's okay at everything, but great at nothing. And in a world where we have so many great options for any task, is starting to feel a little bit behind. The carry is just okay. The contouring definitely helps, but it is heavier than we would like it to be. It's bigger than we would like it to be. Again, that makes it feel a little dated. And similar to the performance, the ergos feel stuck between hard use and light use. It's got the general shape that you would expect to see in hard use, but it doesn't lock you in as much as you want a hard use knife to. And so it ends up feeling a little awkward for every task you would want to use it for, without ever feeling uncomfortable. That's why it's neutral. And the value is definitely pushing it. $449 for this knife is pushing it in 2024. And so that is my review of the Slysz Bowie. I did not like it quite as much as I thought I would. I had heard that this knife would be very sharp at the edge. It is very sharp at the edge. I had heard that it was, cool. It is cool. But as a user, I didn't love it. I will say, I've still got my Spidey Chef review up, but it is certainly not going to take the crown from the Swayback as my favorite Slysz design. If I were to rank them right now, I'd probably put them like this, and the Techno would probably sit between the Swayback and the Spidey Chef. But they're all very good knives, and frankly, if you're looking at this, the other way that you could probably think about this is, if you're looking at this, you probably like the design, and you're asking one of two questions. Question one could be, if I like this design, is it a good enough user that I'm going to actually use this thing? And the answer is absolutely yes. There's nothing about the use of this that is bad. It's totally fine. It just feels a little dated in a lot of ways. But if you're asking yourself, is it worth the hype, in the sense that, is there something special about this knife from a utility perspective, a machining perspective, or a design perspective in 2024 that justifies me buying this over another $450 knife? And I would say in today's day and age, no. In 2015, this is more distinctive because there were a lot fewer knives out there that were slicey but also felt robust. That was something that was relatively rare 10 years ago. It was also relatively rare to get a knife with this fit and finish and this overall look that wasn't made by Chris Reeve or somebody just like Chris Reeve. But the knife market has changed pretty dramatically in that decade. And this now, if this knife just came out today and there was no prior Swysz Bowie, I think it would be kind of like the Paisan was, or kind of like the Drunken was, if you take the drama of the clip out of the way. People would see it as a good knife. Some people would love the design. Some people would get it. Some people would find it very cool, but it wouldn't have the hype that it has if the first version of the Swysz Bowie came out today. So it is more a hype knife than anything, and I would say if you're wondering, if you're not bought into the hype, if you don't love this design, and you're just wondering, should I get a Swysz Bowie? Is there something really special about this knife that makes it worth the $450? Not really. It's cool. It's interesting. It is well designed. It is beautiful. But it's not that special today. So those are my thoughts on the Marcin Swysz Bowie. Not a knife I quite liked quite as much as I thought I would, but not a bad knife. Good knife, just a little out of date. Hope you found that helpful. Hope this helped you make a more informed purchase decision. Let me know your thoughts about the Swysz Bowie down in the comments below. And I hope to see you again soon. This has been Clark the Knife. Have a good one.